I'm Jonathan Chung, and today we're going to get into the weeds with some upper cervical neurology. Last week, my good friend Dr. John Stenberg did a great video breaking some myths about the relationship between the upper cervical spine and its influence on the brainstem. He tackled this idea and this misconception that a lot of upper cervical doctors will say is that the atlas vertebrae, when it shifts and misaligns, it can put direct pressure on the brainstem, and it creates this choking pattern on the brainstem, which is objectively just not true unless you had a really severe Chiari malformation or something along those lines. So this leaves us an important question. If we know that the upper neck is not directly impinging upon the brainstem, then what exactly is happening when the upper neck gets injured and we start to have these brainstem cranial nerve type symptoms? And how does upper cervical chiropractic actually influence these things if we're not directly removing pressure from these structures? In order to get an understanding of what might be happening, then we're going to talk about some hard biological science using this paper as a reference. It's called Neck Muscle Afferents Influence Oromotor and Cardiorespiratory Brainstem Neural Circuits. So an important caveat to this is that this study is done in mice, and just like all biological research, we don't have 100% certainty that these mechanisms are happening in humans, but the only way for us to understand this is to do research on lab animals, because we can't just inject humans with radioactive tracers and dissect out their brainstems to see what's going on. So this gives us at least some type of physiological rationale for what might be happening. One of the reasons that this paper was done is because there's been a clinical observation that patients with neck injuries like those seen in whiplash disorders can often develop different types of symptoms like cervical dystonias, cardiovascular and respiratory problems, reflex control of posture issues, eye position problems, and facial oromotor types of symptoms. The problem is when we look at the actual nerves and the way that they come out, they are going to go into things like your arm, your shoulder, your hands, and fingers, and you're not going to have direct motor innervation for things in the face, meaning it's not going to directly impact the eyes, it's not going to directly impact some of your facial muscles or the sensory nerves that go into the face. So if the neck is going to have some type of influence on some of these structures inside of the head, then it has to be because something about a neck injury is going to influence the sensory nerves that are going to affect the central nervous system and likely through the brainstem neural circuitry. So this research group decided to use sensory stimulation of some of the afferent nerves that come out of your neck muscles and trace them back to see what kind of influence that they had on the brainstem. What they found is that when they electrically stimulated those C2 nerves, that there was a disproportionate activation of something called the nucleus intermedius, which is a perihypoglossal nucleus inside of the brainstem that sits next to a bigger nucleus that actually controls your tongue, called the hypoglossal nucleus. The other interesting thing that they found was that electrically stimulating that C2 nerve inside of the neck created the same level of activation inside the intermedius nucleus as actually taking a probe and directly stimulating that intermediate nucleus itself. The intermediate nucleus is important because it's a pathway that projects into things like your hypoglossal nucleus controlling your tongue, your facial nucleus controlling the muscles of facial expression. It also has really important connections into the rostral and caudal divisions of the ventrolateral medulla, which is where a lot of our sympathetic nerve fibers are going to go that are going to control things like your heart and respiratory rate. And it also has important connections into the nucleus ambiguus and the nucleus tractus solitarius, which are associated with glossopharyngeal and vagal nerve function. So yes, injuries to the upper neck and therapies applied to the upper neck can influence the cranial nerves in the brainstem, but it's not because of direct compression, which would be super dangerous and something that we wouldn't even want to work with. It happens through this more elegant system of plasticity and changes in the functionality of brainstem neural circuitry because of the way that the neck acts as a sensory organ, not just because something is pinched or being choked off.